Good evening, everyone. Hello. It seems I may have been able to have guessed the two topics that may be coming up this evening. You can see from the comments, obviously, the, riots, for want of a better word, far right thug night out will be one of them. And of course, the news that's just sort of come out. Well, I only saw it today. I think it's just come out today about a secret Brexit summit that's taken place involving both senior members of Labour and the Conservatives, as well as various others, to discuss what's going wrong with Brexit and how to put it right. But yeah, we can start off being mindful, of course, of YouTube guidelines. We can start off with exactly what's happened ultimately. So for those who don't know, maybe you're out of the country or something like that, and so there have been, over the years, particularly since Brexit took over the Tory party, there's been quite a lot of hateful rhetoric thrown around. And it's particularly ramped up for two reasons. I think you notice there's a ramping up when one of two things happen. So first of all, it was ramped up quite heavily around the Brexit referendum, and then again in 2019 when, you know, Brexit was in trouble. We may not have left, or we may not have left under the terms that the far right Brexiteers wanted us to leave under. So harmful rhetoric came up, the usual thing about, oh, keep the outsiders out. And at the moment there's another reason now for it, and that is that the Conservatives are in trouble. The Conservatives look likely to lose power. They could improve things. They could help make the NHS better. They could improve people's standards of living in other ways. They could have boosted public sector pay, for example. They could have made sure that they taxed the very wealthy and reduced the tax burden for ordinary people struggling with the cost of living. They could have capped energy prices at much lower than they did. There's all sorts of things that the Conservatives could have done in order to get voters on their side and not be on for a hiding at the next election. But no, their plan is we don't like to do any of that. So what we'll do is we will do what we always do and blame others. And at various points during the Conservatives' time, whenever they're in trouble, they'll blame all sorts of people. But now they're blaming everyone. So, and they'll blame marginalised groups, but they'll blame others as well. But just as, you know, they'll just throw the blame out. So in this particular case, they're blaming asylum seekers. They will also blame the unemployed. They'll blame the disabled. They'll blame academics. They'll blame teachers. They'll blame nurses, doctors. They'll blame whomever they can. It's all their fault. Yes, we're the ones in power, been in power for 13 years, but it's their fault and their fault and their fault and their fault. It's always someone else's fault. But the problem with this is when it works and you do convince some people that it's their fault, they become angry. Because normally, if there is someone causing a problem, you expect the government to step in and deal with it, don't you? For example, if we were to have, if we were to find, well, there's bound to be lots of smuggling rackets going on because of no standards controls. So if you were to expose a big smuggling racket, you'd expect the authorities to break it up, to arrest the people involved, you know, imprison them, whatever it happens to be. The authorities are taking care of it. The government effectively is taking care of it. What we have here is a situation where the government are saying it's all their fault, but they're not doing anything about it. It's almost as if, oh, so the government are powerless to do anything about it. Right, we'll take our own action. And obviously what's happened here is there will be people who are protesting who are not violent right-wing thugs. They've just been badly misinformed by the media and the Tories. But obviously, whenever you've got something like that, you also have far-right thugs who will go along and set fire to police vans, for example. So, you know, this ultimately is a result. You always had this sort of thing, by the way. You would always have an undercurrent of this thing. But the fact that it can blow up like this is entirely down to the Conservatives deliberately stoking this sort of hatred. And you'll notice, or you may not have noticed, I noticed, It took almost 24 hours for the Home Secretary to condemn the violence. I saw a couple of hours ago a tweet that, oh, it's terrible, terrible. And even then she tried to blame the asylum seekers, or at least part blame them. It was, how, really? I mean, normally if some great act of violence comes out, the Home Secretary's straight out there condemning it. It took 24 hours. It was almost like Rishi Sunak had to get on the phone and say, Swella, can you say something? Because this is ridiculous now. Right, I'll go through some comments. Sorry, I may have missed some comments earlier on. Greetings all. Patel and Braverman's bigoted anti-immigration rhetoric from the top of the Home Office are bearing fruit. I mean, it's not just theirs, of course. There's lots of people involved here. You know, the outside the Conservative Party as well. The people that frequent GB News and Talk TV, or some of them, not all of them. For example, Nigel Farage is straight into it, as you'd expect. But I mean, that is what I would say here is this is a direct result of the Conservatives needing a distraction. It's like the classic cartoon, isn't it, where you've got the three people around and you've got the Rupert Murdoch lookalike with the big plate of cookies, and then his construction worker and someone is supposed to be an immigrant, and it's like, and the big wealthy man with the load of cookies is saying to the guy with like 2 cookies on his plate, watch out mate, that immigrant wants your cookie. It's the same thing. It's a way of distracting people from the fact that actually what's wrong with their lives is the government. You know, the blaming the EU doesn't work so well these days. Yes, there's some still trying to say, oh, it's because the EU are being spiteful. But it does fall down a little because people will say, well, hang on, I thought we held all the cards. So it's now much more difficult to blame the EU. So they have to blame people inside the country. And, you know, and the easiest target will be asylum seekers, who are also some of the most vulnerable people. I mean, you've got various organised right-wing thug groups holding up placards. I saw a report, things like saying, oh, 5-star hotels for migrants while Brits freeze. It's like, no, they're not 5-star hotels at all. In fact, these are hotels. If you were to book a hotel, so you're going away somewhere, you would never book one of these hotels. It would never come up on booking.com or anything like that. Interesting how the attack on the hotel follows the report on Prevent by William Shawcross, which essentially said, forget far-right violence and focus on alleged Islamist plots. Give me green light. I don't necessarily think they're directly related, but yes, the timing, is... So Prevent, for those who don't know, I know a lot about it. I was a teacher when it was introduced. It's a system of trying to spot people early and through schools. I mean, that's a big one. You getting teachers basically trying to identify signs of people who might be tending towards extremism, and to prevent them being radicalized. And a lot of the people who pushed the idea in the Conservative Party, of course, were thinking, oh, we'll deal with Muslims this way. And but when I was being trained in Prevent by police officers in my area, we were told in no uncertain terms that actually Islamic extremism is not an issue. I'm in the North Midlands. The issue is far right extremism of the sort we see on display here. And so what's, you're saying what's happening now is because the people who really wanted Prevent to be like Islamophobic, not actually to deal with extremism, are going, oh, we don't spend enough time on Islamic extremism. We need to have a bit more of a focus on that. But the whole Prevent thing was a nonsense anyway. I say it was a nonsense, it's still in place. It's not that the ideals are there's nothing wrong with it. It's just that it doesn't, you're putting a lot of the onus on teachers, and then yes, you can't always spot all the signs. You can only, as teachers we used to get training on lots and lots of things each year, and you can't be an expert in any of them. But anyway, would McDonnell have been a better leader than Corbyn in 2015? They had the same economic policies. McDonnell seemed more pragmatic, would have campaigned harder for Remain. In all honesty, I don't know. I mean, it's really a bit off kilter here. Corbyn is useless. I'm sorry if that upsets anyone. It doesn't matter that you like his policies. I mean, I like his domestic policies. Any of his international policies are all bollocks. But domestic policies, yeah. But he was never competent enough to bring them to the fore. McDonnell, yes, was more pragmatic, but is he pragmatic enough? No. He still wasn't pragmatic enough. Either of them, I mean, we saw what would happen, right? Liz Truss, that's what would have happened with Corbyn and McDonnell, right? People go, oh, everything would be brilliant now. There are lots of things that would have been better if they'd have won in 2019. COVID would have been better managed. But I'll tell you what, because you wouldn't be able to see the both realities, the Tory press would be saying that Labour had actually messed it up. The NHS winter crises wouldn't have got this bad. The energy price wouldn't have gone up like that. So lots of things would be better, but would people appreciate those? It's difficult to say. But they would have done as much damage to the economy as Liz Truss did, because they were planning to. They actually were working on a plan to deal with a run on the pound. So they knew that their plans would create turmoil in the markets. Because remember, they don't like them. They don't like the market. It's like, well, I don't. There's a difference between not liking an economic model and just pretending it doesn't exist, or that you can somehow change it overnight. So no, anyone in that sort of bubble, none of them are realistic. None of them at all are pragmatic at all. The fact that McDonnell showed signs that he can learn would have made him better, but I still don't think he would have won the election, because it's not just about the person at the top. It's like the people they surrounded themselves with are always you. I mean, I talk at the moment about Rishi Sunak's advisors being useless, clearly useless. Well, so were Corbyn's. Would McDonnell's have been any different? Would he have had different advisors around him? Because they're all in that same clique. It's all just, you know, that have just surrounded themselves with each other. I think McDonnell was the brains of the Corbyn team. He was clearly the one with the greatest capacity to learn lessons. But like I say, I mean, it was because they were all just bound together and they didn't trust people outside their little circle. It would have been the same people, just in different chairs. That's all. It would have been the same people in a different seat. You know, as like, you know, Labour keeps saying about Rishi Sunak's reshuffle, it's just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. I mean, that's, you know. John said, I've worked in the Prevent programme, it's seriously flawed. And it's, the reason why it's flawed is because, although there's nothing wrong with the basic aims, that wasn't really the reason it was put in place. And whenever you've got something, it's a little bit like, I don't know, it's just when the stated aims are just there to get public approval, but what you really want to do with it is something else, then you'll never get anything really noble out of it. Should have some form of psychology professional in every school. Not that I expect we'd have anywhere near enough to implement that. No, and funding would be an issue as well. You know, I mean, consider there was a time. I mean, you know, there was a time where every school had a nurse, for example. You had the school nurse. Do you remember that? Well, I don't know. You may not remember it. I remember it. When I was very young, wasn't there when I left school. The school nurse. Schools don't have a nurse anymore. The NHS doesn't have nurses anymore. You know, but that was a thing. We used to have properly funded public services. Am I one of the 12 peers of Charlemagne's court now? Explain paladin. It's purely a fantasy thing. It's the sort of paladin that has a big hammer that smashes orcs over the head with it. Who's McDonnell? So John McDonnell was Corbyn's shadow chancellor when he was leading the Labour Party. You know, and I'll tell you why. Again, I was disappointed because he did keep showing signs of learning, but he disappointed me because he should and could. He was invited to be involved in Labour's policy groups under Starmer, and he refused. We know why he refused, because it's like, oh, you should reinstate Corbyn. It's like, no, you broke the rules. Leave. I know he's your mate, but leave it alone. You know, John McDonnell had the opportunity to work with Labour to help shape policy, and he turned it down. They all turned it down. This is what gets me when people go, oh, Starmer's excluding all these people from the left. It was like, well, he's not. It's just the hard left refused to work with him. They were offered positions. They just didn't take them. The knit nurse, well, okay. Wasn't just, I mean, I remember not just for that. But no, I remember in a school, like in junior school, it wasn't there. I think we did still have one when I went to comprehensive school, but only for a few years. It wasn't there when I left. She wasn't there when I left. But yeah, if you were injured or ill, you went to the nurse. Go to the nurse. The nurse had an office. You know. You're writing an essay on democracy. Any thoughts? I've got lots of thoughts on anything in particular. Did I hear more about McDonnell being more pro-Ukraine? I mean, you know, the minimum bar for any person who aspires to government should be that if you have two countries and one of them invades the other specifically to wipe out those people and engages in a campaign of genocide and virtually every crime against humanity you can think of, the bare minimum is that you are on the side of the victims. You know, war sometimes happens, and well, war happens a lot, but what I mean is sometimes there are reasons to declare war, but you do not invade another country specifically to wipe them out and steal their shinies. At a bare minimum, you must absolutely categorically condemn the act of aggression there. And the thing is, like, you know, they'll try and say, oh, we argued against the Iraq war because that's all they've got. It's like, yeah, but you didn't argue against Syria and Russia murdering, you know, committing genocide in Syria, did you? You didn't argue against Russia committing genocide in Ukraine. You know, if you cannot be consistent, then you are actually just on the side of Russia. That's what for a lot of, there are people who of course were against the Iraq war because it was clearly not justified. But there were lots of people because they were just, as you know, they were just anti-West, really. They still think Russia is this like communist utopia, or it could be again. McDonnell is very bright. He used to run rings around Osborne in Parliament, but Osborne always had the right-wing press to cover his back. There's several of them that are not stupid, but they're not practical either. That's the problem. Your high school had the nurse's office, but no nurse to be seen ever. I wonder if it was when they were being phased out then. There were quite a few things phased out when I was at school. Teaching programming was one of them. Computer programming, that was a thing, and that was phased out when I was at school. Went to the Tories. Stupid bloody decision that was. Also, when you're talking about modern foreign languages, so in my first year at comprehensive school, the MFL room was one, you know, those old-fashioned things we got lots of booths and you had the headphones and you listened to a tape and just repeated back what it said. That was there in my first year. It wasn't there in the second year. But anyway, right, we're not waxing lyrical on my past being brought up under a Tory government. Well, okay, sounds good. The left and unions continuously having a pop at Starmer is massively beneficial for him in the eyes of voting public, isn't it? Not necessarily, no. And I will just say here, um, the unions don't have a pop at Starmer a lot. Most of them support what he's doing. There's you can sometimes get the impression, because there's a lot of noisy ones, like you'll see in the media that Mick Lynch says this thing, or Sharon Graham says this thing. You don't really see in the media like all the other union leaders saying a different thing, or not all of them, but So there's a little group of there is a little group of union leaders who see their position as a sort of pseudo politician, and they're trying to drive a political agenda instead of actually just trying to do the best for their members. But then you have other union, secretary generals or whatever they call the head of their unions, the senior leadership of their unions, who actually are just trying to get the best for their members. And most unions are like that. For example, I've never, like when I was in teaching, there was always been several teaching unions. Even the NUT, which was the most militant of them, they weren't really, trying to turn it into like a political party or anything like that. John said, Nick Nurse, I remember those in the encouragement stick. Yeah, I remember the encouragement stick sort of and sort of not. So when I was at school, corporal punishment had been banned, but for the first 2 years of compulsory education, what we would now call year 1 and 2, I actually went to a private school until my parents decided it was too bloody expensive, and back I was in the local state school. And there they did have corporal punishment. In fact, what would happen is sometimes someone would come in from another class and say, Mrs. Greenwood would like to borrow the meter ruler, please. Which meant someone was getting a smack on the ass. So although corporal punishment was illegal even when I was very, very young in state schools, it had only just been made illegal. And there were some teachers who took a little time to adapt. So occasionally they would throw things. They wouldn't hit you, but they would occasionally throw things. What are my views on state grammar schools? So I am actually... Comprehensive education it's one of those pragmatic compromises that I just say we should just have. In theory, I am much more in favour of having comprehensive education up to a point, and then as people show promise in certain areas, developing them. I'm quite happy to have specialist schools, so you can have like a school with more of an academic route and a school with more like what used to have like the grammar schools and the technical colleges or something, didn't you? I mean, that's before my time, but I think that was the case. The problem is, inevitably in a situation like that, what happens is they're not seen as alternative routes into employment. They're seen as a first and second class situation. If you're clever, you can do the academic route. Even if you might like a different route. You might want to be a plumber. You can still be clever and be a plumber. You might need to be clever and be a plumber sometimes. But no. If you're clever, you go down the academic route. If you're thick, you go down the manual route. Well, that's no good. Or it could, and because of that, you had people would be coached, like if you're middle class family, you'd be coached to help you pass the 11 plus. So it doesn't really work when you try and do that. So I would just say comprehensive education, although I'm in favour in theory of as soon as people are showing promise and interest in certain areas, develop that. Like when someone's 15 and 16, why are you teaching them history if they don't like history? Like you give them a grounding for a certain length of time, or science, something like that. Like maths and English, yeah, make sure you do the basics, but up to at a certain point, just go, look, what are they showing an interest and an aptitude for? Develop that. But it wouldn't work out like that. It would never work out like that because we've got too much of a class system in this country. But anyway, any union that deals with the government will need a press strategy, though. It'll inevitably play out in the media. Oh yeah, they need to be politically savvy. It's a bit like economists. Economists need to be politically savvy. But there's a difference between trying to using your union as a hobby horse. You know, the likes of Len McCluskey, for example. I mean, well, it wasn't just a hobby horse for him; it was a source of cash. Something that Sharon Graham's having to deal with now. But it's, for some of them, they just want it to push their own. Like, take Unite, for example. So Sharon Graham of Unite, she was up against Howard Beckett for the role when McCluskey stepped down. Do you know what he wanted to do? He wanted to build he wanted to have them broadcast. He wanted the Unite. He wanted a TV studio. He wanted to waste their members' money on a TV studio so he could broadcast again, because all he wanted it for was his own political platform. Because these people, they don't really fancy the traditional political route. So, because the traditional political route would be for people like that getting into the Labour Party, but they also know that the Labour leadership, when it wants to win, won't really involve them. So they'll be just on the sideline. So it's like, well, but if I become the leader of a union, I've got all those union resources, I can do what I like, which is wrong. But anyway, right. So we seem to have slipped into education here now. Education policy. Went to an army school abroad. Corporal punishment allowed but never used because parents told and expected to deal with it. Never got hit by my dad as a look was enough. Comprehensive education wins every time. People learn at different rates, need to retain the same opportunities as long as possible. Well, the different rates is another thing though, where it does fail, because in this country, as in a lot of countries, but not all, you progress through the key stages based on when your birthday is. There's never any assessment and then, right, you need to spend more time on this. So what inevitably happens is, and I've seen this as a teacher, particularly as a maths teacher, you get kids about 14 or 15 and you're teaching them the stuff on the GCSE syllabus, and yet they still can't do times tables or fractions, basic fractions. And you're thinking, well, so, we don't, it's not progressive. We don't, there's a progression when you're teaching a lot of topics, particularly skills-based topics. Not so much knowledge-based. Knowledge-based stuff you can, chop and change a bit. But for skills-based stuff in particular, there's a sequence, there's a progression. You've got to learn the foundation before you can go to the next stage and so on. And people don't progress like that, and they should. But again, what would happen if we did that? The easiest way to do it would be to hold people back. Well, that's humiliating. You don't want to do that. And it's all like they must do their GCSEs when they're like 15, 16, and it's all got to be geared up to then, and it doesn't work. So there's lots, but no system probably works that way in this country, because, we can never have an honest debate in public about it, and we can't in politics have an honest debate. I felt a lot of sympathy for, Keir Starmer a few weeks ago when he was asked, oh, what sort of environment do you prefer, Westminster or Davos? And he said, oh, Davos, because Westminster's too constrained. And what he was getting, and loads of people was going, oh, he's just interested in those. He doesn't care about democracy, the seat of democracy. And what he was saying is, no, it's because there's no debate in Parliament. You don't have real debates in Parliament. You can tell exactly how a debate is going to go depending on how many MPs each party has. You present to me some debate that Parliament's going to have, and I will tell you how it's going to go depending on how many MPs the Tories have, how many Labour have, Lib Dems, SNP, and so on. I'll tell you exactly how that debate will go. That's not a debate, because a debate is an exchange of ideas, and then at the end of it, people will form their views. The views are formed right from the start. In fact, there aren't even any views, because most MPs just will not just vote, but debate the way they're told to. You'll have leaders plant questions for debate, or, from backbenchers. But anyway, I'm saying, if I'd been able to study exactly the subjects I had interest in and was allowed to drop those I had no interest in Napoleon, I think it would have been very different. It always will be. You're saying I did French, so it wasn't too bad, but I'd have dropped maths and English. Oh no, I wouldn't be in favour of that, because they are useful in life, no matter what you do. They're useful for everything. But there are other things where you want a grounding in it, but then you could just leave it. You know, GCSE, for example, once you're 13, 14, if you're showing no great aptitude for science, what's the point? Or history or geography. I mean, if you think, so if I go through what I had to do, it can be different schools, and it can certainly be different ages. I did it a long time ago. I did 10 GCSEs. I only got to choose 2 of them. And even then it wasn't much of a choice. The 2 I chose to do were design and technology and German. If I could have done, I would have chosen German and Latin. But I couldn't do both of those. I had to pick one because they were in the same pool. So I didn't really get much choice. So I chose German because it's more useful. And even design and technology, which is like electronics mostly, I didn't choose that. I actually chose the design and communication, which was technical drawing. But then it was full, so I couldn't do that either. So I didn't really get much choice. I only actually chose effectively 1 subject out of my 10. And I had to do science, maths and English, which I would have wanted to do anyway. I had to do 2 types of English. I had to do English literature. I wouldn't have chosen to do that. I had to do history. Wouldn't have chosen to do that. I had to do geography. Would not have chosen to do that. And all of that, so English literature, history, design and technology was not, you know, it's useful, so I'm not going to complain too much about that. But history, geography and English literature, that was all time that I spent in a classroom that I could have been spent developing better skills in the areas that I was interested in. But you know, there it is. Parliament's all prepared questions and no comebacks. Yeah, that is. I mean, that's exactly the point Starmer's making. Because remember, Starmer is not. He's not a politician. A lot of people in Parliament have been politicians all their adult life. You know, they may not have become an MP as soon as they left university, but they'll have become a political advisor. They'll have worked in politics, and even if they were doing a normal job, they'd have been involved in their CLP. They might, you know, volunteered and been around their MP and councillors. They might have worked as a councillor. You know, whereas Starmer was politically active when he was young. Then of course he became a lawyer, and then he came into it later. So, you know, he's sort of someone who doesn't really, he's not interested in all the sort of usual rough and tumble of it. He just wants things done. He wants to make decisions. Since I'm a science teacher, surely Latin would have been useful to me in biology, for instance. Animals have Latin names. Yeah, well, that's exactly why I wanted to do it, because I had an interest in science. Specifically, I wanted to be a doctor at the time, and there's a lot of Latin terminology used in medicine. So I thought, you know, this would be handy. I mean, I had enough interest in medicine already, so I'd already been learning like anatomy. I'd been learning the names of the bones, and there's a lot of Latin in those. Also, I was interested in astronomy, and there's a lot of Latin in astronomy as well, so it's quite interesting, you know, the constellations, actually knowing what the words mean and so on. So I had an interest in Latin. Admittedly, not enough of an interest to have just picked it. I could have just learned it as a hobby. I learnt enough to understand the terms I was using. But anyway, going on a slightly different one here. John Major was the last competent Tory PM. He helped negotiate peace in Northern Ireland. He improved the economy towards the 1997 election. Yeah, it's difficult. I sometimes wonder. I don't like Theresa May in terms of her policies, but I do sometimes wonder if she really had an opportunity to display any level of basic competence, because David Cameron didn't have to deal with Brexit for his first 5 years, and it was his fault he had to deal with it at all. So he had every opportunity to show that he could do the job of Prime Minister, and he didn't. And I don't just mean because he introduced austerity. I mean, that was his politics. But the fact that he dropped the ball so many times. I mean, over Syria, for example, famously, he took his eye off the ball there. Boris Johnson, of course, has also had the opportunity to govern. He hasn't just had to deal with Brexit, and he's failed that test. Liz Truss failed it spectacularly. Rishi Sunak is failing to cope with it. Whereas Theresa May was in that period of time where everything was Brexit. Absolutely everything was Brexit. So I'm not sure if she ever really had if there was any way of actually testing whether she could have been competent or not, you know, even if it was competent in a quite terrible way. Everyone should know the scientific method is. See, the thing is, you know, if you think there's 11 years of compulsory education, you don't need all 11 to teach people a basic standard of science. You know, if it's taught properly sequentially, and you don't, you know, and you don't need all 11 years. 8 years is fine. I say German's a complicated language. I grew up with it. There's a certain logic to German that I quite appreciated. French was too awkward for me, not least of which was pronouncing the words, because you had to try and work out which letters you just don't bother with. You know, German had a certain logic to it. Latin had no logic at all. So for Latin, it was really just the vocabulary I was interested in learning. But then, to be fair, Latin's an older language. It doesn't have to be as refined. I saw something earlier about MPs. They used to have to wear a top hat to make a point of order as recently as the 1990s. No, I don't think so. This rule should be reinstated. Surely not. I don't remember seeing top hats in Commons because they were filmed in the 90s. They were filmed in the 80s. Surely not. I'm gonna have to look that up now, aren't I? I'm not sure I believe that. Now, there have been some things change. You know, the Speaker of the House did used to wear the wig. I think, you know, I think it was only Betty Boothroyd that stopped that. But before Betty Boothroyd, the Speaker of the House would wear you know, the wig, like the judicial type wig. So things have certainly changed a bit, although the system for voting is still that archaic mess. Understanding of the scientific method would help business a lot. Working data, I have 2 science degrees. Very frustrating how few people understand the basic principles of data collection. Yes, I mean, things, yeah, that's what I mean. There's a lot of useful stuff that would be useful in lots of, like, what you might think are unrelated areas in math, science, English, history as well. But again, you do not need all 11 of those years to teach it to people if you're going to teach it properly. Part of the problem is we just recap a lot of stuff as we go through those 11 years because it's not really taught very effectively, because we're trying to cram too many facts and no one knows them. Like the people who run our government, if I was to give Jeremy Hunt, he's the Chancellor of the Exchequer, if I was to give him a little test on maths, I bet you he wouldn't do very well. Rishi Sunak is running the whole government. If I was to give him a little test on, say, project management, I bet he wouldn't do very well. You know, my last gig as a teacher part-time was teaching project management to some engineering students. If I was to give Rishi Sunak one of the exam papers, I bet you he wouldn't do very well. So they don't have, you know, even the people who run our country do not have the skills that we're supposed to be teaching to people in schools. So why push lots and lots of facts? Why not just focus on some of the more useful ones and develop a deeper understanding of them so that they can apply them? The reason is, of course, I know the reason. The reason is because then you would have time to teach critical thinking, and, you know, there's quite a lot of politicians, the last thing they want is a population trained in critical thinking. Basic knowledge of economics would be more useful than most things. It would have been over the last 10 years, certainly, would have stopped people falling for Tory lies, yes. Oh, we've got a confirmation about the top hat thing. I'm going to have to look it up because I find that remarkable. Apart from anything else, what were women supposed to do? Were they supposed to have a top hat as well? How does continuing to ramp up energy prices help the Tories' electoral chances? Come April, the Tories' poll ratings will drop even further. Why not implement a real windfall tax to improve their polling? Do you know, at this point, I honestly do not know. Like, I know it's easy to just say, you know, the Conservatives are all about letting the rich not pay taxes and taxing the poor, because they have this mindset, and it's not just cruelty. They have this mindset. Well, taxes are used to pay for public services, and quite a lot of very wealthy people are not really using them because they'll go private or something like that. They use the roads and so on, but they're essentially going private for a lot of these public services. You know, they pay for private schools for their children, they pay for private healthcare. So it's not really fair to make them pay a lot of taxes. Whereas ordinary people, they're using the NHS, they're using, you know, state schools and all the rest of it. So yeah, they should shoulder the burden of paying for it all. That's what they think. But in this particular case, it doesn't make sense because they've cut it too far. You know, they're squeezing people too much. And you know, even Conservatives with a particular philosophy understand that you have to also be realistic. The reverse is also true. So, for example, I'm a socialist, so I want public services to be effectively properly controlled by the state. I don't want private provision in them. So if you take the NHS, for example, I want all of the hospitals to be built by the state. I want the doctors and nurses employed directly by the state. I want all of the medical services offered by the state. The private involvement for the NHS would be things like your stationery or getting your computer systems in. I don't expect, you know, but the medical services should all be state controlled, paid for, no profits, all the rest of it. And yet, does that mean I'm one of the people that complains that Labour said they will use private provision in order to get the waiting list down when they come to power? No, because you've got to be realistic. If you didn't do that, that means you keep the waiting list high. Well, that's a non-starter. You know, the reverse, it should be true. And it is true of some Conservatives. There are Conservative, even currently sitting MPs who have said, we're squeezing people too much, and they are in favour of a proper windfall tax. Even though normally it would be against their politics, they understand that the particular situation we have now requires it. Liz Truss had the best of advice but ignored it. Yes, some knowledge herself might have helped. Maybe. Well, the problem is she thought she had it because she did PP at university and the E is economics, but it's not very good. Going back to the strike situation, how do I see it ending? Is this a case of the government adopting a position similar to Custer's last stand? I honestly at this point have no idea. I cannot for the life of me understand how the Conservatives ever thought that. I understand the notion of trying to sow division in society. The problem is that they're hurting quite a lot of the people they need on their side. It's I do not see the sense in quite a lot of what the government are doing at the moment. In regarding the public sector pay, it's an absolute nonsense. And yeah, as we were just saying, the raising the energy prices by 40% again, that's domestic energy prices. The business energy price, I don't even know what's going to happen to that, but the support is largely being withdrawn for that. So, and it's madness. The only thing I can think of is because in their heads, the general election is going to be in 2024. So what they're trying to do is, I suppose it's a little bit like, you know, if you sat in a chair and you go, are you comfortable? And you go, well, it's all right. It's all right. I'm not particularly, it's okay though. So they instead what they do is they grab hold of you and they tie you with rope. They bind you with rope and tie you to the back of their car, and then they drive you around the block so that you're banging yourself on the gravel and everything. And then they put you back in the chair and you go, are you comfortable now? Yeah, it's bloody comfortable now compared to it. And it's a bit like what they're trying to do is go as hard as they can, squeeze as hard as they can this year, so that next year they'll alleviate the pressure and everyone will think all of a sudden, oh, you know, and they'll do what they always do. They'll say, oh, you know, we had these tough times, but we had to act this way. It was the responsible thing to do. But now we've done it. It's done. That's it now. No more. We can now start to improve the situation. You should start to feel that your, you know, living standards are rising again, and it will carry on as long as you just vote for us again. But if you vote for Labour, they'll just ruin it again. And then we'll have to come in and sort their mess out. That's what they will aim to do. That is what their strategy, I think, will be, because I can see no other possibility. I just think they just fail to, and it's because they don't understand. And none of them understand. Like, it's quite easy to show that Rishi Sunak doesn't understand the real suffering that's been caused to people, because he has never experienced that suffering. He grew up in a well-off household, and he is now part of a extremely wealthy household. He has no concept of the day-to-day struggle at all, and he never has. But even on the other end of the scale, the people like Lee Anderson, who will have known what it was like to struggle a bit, but he doesn't now, because overnight his salary more than trebled, and now he's I mean, I don't even know how much he's earning by doing, you know, various other things. So, you know, he's now in the money, and he clearly, because he doesn't care about other people, it doesn't matter to him that he remembers what it was like to struggle a little bit. He will just claim that he never struggled. He will say, well, I managed. And he'll never look back, because he now does not intend ever to go back on that sort of income. He wants the big bucks. You know, he wants to maintain the sort of income that he's been getting, which is a much larger one than he had. So they don't really appreciate. And of course, Lee Anderson will never have existed under this current cost of living crisis, because he was an MP before it really started squeezing. But so I think there is a part of it that they just, although there will be strategy in it, thinking that they can just ease the pressure next year, I don't think they realise just how much damage they're doing this year, and that it just won't be enough. What do I think is a realistic timescale for any competent government to fix the NHS from the next general election? In all honesty, surely not. If you mean fix as in have it working properly, so that probably 20 years, and I don't think I'm exaggerating. When I look back at what happened to the NHS when Labour came to power in 1997, it actually took a lot of years. And bear in mind that the economy was booming then. But it doesn't matter how much money the government's got, it still takes time to bed in improvements, to actually put them in place, because you can't just throw money at the problem. You need money, of course, but you actually need to, the money has to be paid for, and you can't just like magic up an NHS again. And that was when the money was there. I mean, imagine what it's going to be like for the next Labour government, where the economic constraints are much more severe. And the NHS now is in a worse situation than it was when John Major left it. There were winter crises when John Major left it. He still left it in a terrible state. But it's not as bad as now. I wrote a comment about French earlier because it said I found it hard. Yeah, I did find it hard. It made no sense to me. I mean, I suppose part of the reason will be English is largely a Germanic language. I mean, it's a mongrel language. It's all sorts of things. But, you know, I think I just found German more logical. See, Lee Anderson's now going by the name of Leanderthal. Yeah. Is it true the EU price cap on gas is £37 per megawatt hour, whereas UK price cap 263.79? It's a lot higher in the UK. I don't actually know the specifics, in all honesty. Also, like EU, yeah, I don't know the specifics. But it is quite eye-watering just how much it's gone up in the last couple of years. Took Labour 9 years to get health spending to the EU average. Oh, there we go then. He's looked it up. I know I was looking at these charts a little while ago as well, but it did take a long time. And that was just the EU. I mean, you're saying the EU average there. It was still going up, and it still needed to go up. You know, average isn't really good enough. So I think it will take an extremely long. And this is why I keep coming back to it. Nothing that Starmer can achieve. He cannot finish the job. Even if he wins 3 terms, and let's say, and we know what happens. Leaders don't last that long. They'll shit the bed. Starmer will not be any different. Something will happen, whether it's just familiarity breeds contempt, or whether he actually just makes a big blunder or something. I don't know. But, you know, even if he keeps winning elections, he will be removed at some point, because at some point people will feel it's time for a change. And the party, if the Labour Party wants to continue to win, they will get rid of him. And I mean, he may walk long before, maybe, as far as, I mean, he may not even want to go on for that long. He may just want to start the ball rolling. But he cannot possibly finish the job. So then you've got to think to yourself, so how do you protect it? And you can't obviously put something in place that literally bans the Conservative Party from taking office, because doing anything like that would be undemocratic. But you can at least stop extremists having all of the power. And the way, of course, to do that is to reform Westminster elections. And proportional representation is the best way. I mean, people will sometimes say about compulsory voting, if I could work my will, I would say full proportional representation and compulsory voting. If you had those 2 things, then even with our shitty media, you would prevent extremists really taking over again. Because extremists, the sort of people that extremists fire up, they fire them up to go and vote. So really the people who don't vote tend to be more moderate, who are turned off by politics. Those are the people who don't vote, the people who are turned off by politics, by and large. You know, you may have some people who every now and then they're interested in politics, but every now and then they just feel they can't vote for anyone. But by and large, it's people who are sick of the whole thing. But they're the moderating votes. So if you had compulsory voting, you introduced the moderating votes. But you do need proportional representation alongside it. You can't just have compulsory voting, because then all you have is Australia. You found French easy. Pronunciation tips. The last consonant of a word is always silent unless a vowel follows it. Yeah, that's already too much. Do you know how it works in Germany? You read the word out. Well done, you can speak German. And sentence structure is very consistent as well. And it literally is what it says. You know, ambulance, Krankenwagen, sick car, or wagon, whatever. Makes sense. My favourite was, well, hang on. Yeah, the Tories managed to cut public spending and increase the national debt. Madness. But this is inevitable. All these people go, oh, if you cut taxes, you'll generate growth. No, the opposite happens. The opposite happens. You know, cutting public expenditure means that you don't have the infrastructure in place to allow your economy to grow. What does your economy need to grow? It needs businesses to be making more money. You need to sell more. Well, how do you do that? Well, you have workers that keep turning up for work. So that means when they have an injury, they need it treated quickly so they can get back to work. If they have an illness, they need it treated quickly so they can get back to work. It means you need the workers who've got the skills. You know, my partner, who works for a large multinational in the construction industry, produces building materials, she's constantly bemoaning the fact there's people in the company who are supposed to be sort of doing similar jobs to her, data analysis. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know how to use Excel. They don't know how to use any of the tools they're supposed to be using. They have no idea. But they're still working in that place, and there's some massive inefficiency. So, you know, that company would make loads more money if it had skilled people in place. Now, part of it will be not always appointing the right person. That can always go wrong if you've got a bad manager. But, you know, part of it is just having the people with the skills. So you need to spend on education. You know, roads. You know, if you're getting things held up all the time because there's roadworks all the time, because you keep making roads, you keep using the cheap temporary road surface that breaks up every winter. You know, all of these things have all of them help the economy. You cannot, if you reduce your infrastructure to the point where it's not working well enough, of course you're going to hurt the economy. What do I think Keir Starmer would like as his legacy? In all honesty, I really don't know. You know, I honestly don't know what he sees. I hope it's reform, like serious reform of politics. I know he's going to try and reform that. And people will say things. He is cautious, and people say, "Oh, he's just going to try and tinker with things." He's not. I keep saying this. One thing that is absolutely certain: he's not coming to politics to tinker. Someone who has had the career he's had in law. I mean, he was basically ready for. He could have gone off to do, you know, grander jobs, or gone in, or just retired, whatever. He's gone into politics, and he's gone in hard. He wants to do something. He wants something big. He doesn't just want to clean up the Tories' mess. You know, he wants to actually do something big. And consider when he came into politics, 2015. So the situation wasn't as bad then. You know, we'd still had austerity, but there's no Brexit or anything like that. When he came into politics, Labour hadn't gone down the cul-de-sac of making Jeremy Corbyn leader. You know, so the shitty situation that has transpired will not have been predictable at the time. Under PR, how would the party split up? Over time, I would expect Labour and the Conservatives to both split in two. It's quite difficult because part of it will be based not just on how you might expect their policies to like, but individual people. Like a strong leader can keep the party together for longer, but ultimately you would expect both Labour and the Conservatives to split into two. Now, whether it's literally splitting into two or just a load of Tories go and join Reform UK, so you have the Conservative Party in Reform UK, and a load of people in Labour going off and joining like Socialist Workers Party or something, I don't know. But that is, I think, what would happen. You'd also see the Green Party grow. You'd see the Lib Dems grow as well. But the Green Party will grow. But it will take time. It will take time. What do I think government should do to reduce misinformation, heavy bias in the media? Introduce laws to prevent the media just basically lying to people. And you know, there must be ways to do that because there are countries that have media laws. It's quite straightforward to stop them deliberately misleading. There are things that are just matters of fact. You just make it illegal to deliberately lie. You can't force them. You can't sort of say, like we could say about going back to the original thing about the far right violence around immigration accommodation, like asylum seekers accommodation. You can't, and the media aren't really reporting on it. Like the Guardian's reporting on it, but a lot of the media aren't really reporting on it. You can't make it illegal to not report things that are of public interest, or you can't say, oh, hang on, you can't put too much of an emphasis that's something that's quite trivial. So you'll never be able to control the editorial process, but you can stop them just outright lying. You can always, in fact, Labour, I mean, because here's the thing, in terms of what Labour's going to do, I'll tell you something, media laws will change. I'm not saying it'll all be brilliant all of a sudden and he's going to tackle the blight of our corrupt media, but things are going to change. You know, I think foreign ownership is something that I think could be looked at in all seriousness. You know, do you ban foreign ownership of media, news media? That'd be interesting. Saw David Lammy on LBC sympathising with the caller's wish for PR. Did not deny or approve that Labour would implement, but there was a lack of optimism from the call. I mean, Keir Starmer has also done the same thing. I just think if these people are serious about having any legacy at all, because you look at Tony Blair and you go, well, what's his legacy, Iraq, basically? Because it's the only thing, honestly, and I'm not someone who goes on about that all the time. But what else? What else? In all honesty, like you might say the Good Friday Agreement, but that's under pressure. There's what is there that the Tories haven't destroyed in terms of his domestic policy? What is there really left? Not a lot. There's not a lot. Granted, the Tories haven't abolished all the equalities legislation that Labour brought in, although they have with some. But it's really hard to point at anything and say that the last Labour government fixed that and it's now fine, because it's all broken again. So how do you make sure you have a legacy? You have to make sure it's protected. What's my take on Ukraine? That's quite a complicated subject and we've run out of time. Depends what you mean. I'll try and get through the last few here. The last Labour government had a budget surplus and they say the Tories are good at the economy. Well, yes. I mean, this is one of the most pervasive lies in British politics. Why don't the parties enlist candidates that are Labour / Tory rather than letting factions like the ERG? Well, this is what Starmer is doing in Labour at the moment, and of course the extremists are giving him stick over it. Momentum whining at the moment. Oh, the candidates should be chosen by local people, not Starmer's henchmen. It's like, well, they are chosen by local people. It's just that they exclude people who are clearly not Labour. That's all. So that is what is happening in Labour. Why didn't it happen with the Conservatives? Well, that's what they're now suffering from. They may have to go through a similar process themselves, a proper vetting process, but I don't expect it to happen quickly. ERG tend to be backed by rich donors. No ERG candidate, no donation. That won't be true either. The Conservatives are the only show in town for the very wealthy. What are they going to do? Pull the donations and just let Labour rule, for time immemorial? I don't think so. It's the same thing with going back to David Cameron, the ERG, all these threats. David Cameron backed down. But David Cameron could have just told them to shut up. Stop causing trouble. Do you want Labour in? Because if you keep causing trouble, you're just going to let Ed Miliband in. And then when Jeremy Corbyn took over, even easier. If he'd have stood up to them in 2015 and they carried on at him for the next election, he'd have just said, "Do you want Jeremy Corbyn in?" Because that's how you get Jeremy Corbyn in. And he could have just shut them up. It would have been so easy. It's not complicated at all. Every Conservative leader since the referendum has had problems. It's not been that straightforward to just stand up to them. But for David Cameron, it was actually easy. I'm going to correct Irene there. It said Lee Anderson used to be a Labour MP. No, he didn't. He was a Labour councillor. He only became an MP for the first time with the Tories. Although, do you know what he's claiming? He's claiming that he left the Labour Party. It's an interesting way of describing getting kicked out, but never mind. Right, well, we have sort of run out of time there. We'll just echo this from Matthew. John Major played a part in the Good Friday Agreement. Yes, of course, a lot of the groundwork was done by the Conservatives before Labour took over. But, so that's why I'm quite happy to call that, it was a real joint effort on all sorts of parts, not just, the main parties in Westminster, but also the Irish government, the EU, the American government, and cross-party support in America as well, Republicans and Democrats. And it needed to be. It needed to be. But anyway, we'll leave it there. Thanks very much for coming on. Have a good evening, everyone. And until next time, I'll see you later.